Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains very difficult to decipher sometimes. And today, we are going to discuss two, preserved steam locomotives that were once preserved, but one of them was, the other's still around, that were both owned by a man named Richard Jensen. Oh no. Yeah, we're talking about Jensen again. This is the story of Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, numbers 5632 and 4963. Now, I want to preface this video with the fact that if you haven't seen my other video about the locomotives that Jensen owned, namely 5629, you may want to check that out before finishing this, as I am going to be alluding to some of the issues that happened with 5629, but this video is obviously going to be focusing on these other two that he owned, and this story is a heck of a lot different than 5629. Whereas with that one, it was pretty clear that it was basically all Jensen's fault. This time there's a definite mix of blame, in some ways. Not all, but some. But before we really get into the details, let's talk about both these locomotives. Both, as I said, originally belonged to the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. It was generally just called the Burlington route, or the Burlington, or even just the Q. CB&Q operated extensive trackage across Colorado, Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, Wisconsin, and Wyoming, even going down as far as Texas, though they aren't around anymore. In 1970, they would merge with Northern Pacific Railway and the Great Northern Railway to form Burlington Northern. Burlington Northern itself would again merge later with Santa Fe to become BNSF, which is still around. But back in the 50s, it was doing exactly what everyone else was doing when it came to steam locomotives, namely getting rid of them, because things were dieselizing. We'll start with 4963, as she is the older of the two. She was an 01A, a 282 Mikado-type steam locomotive that was built in 1923 by Baldwin for the railroad. She was mostly used to haul mainline freight trains, and worked diligently on the railroad for about 30 years. They were designed to be pretty fast, especially by freight train standards, and for her time, 4963 was a perfectly capable locomotive. Mikados were a very successful type, so it's understandable that she would do well. But as dieselization was coming into the fold, most of her sisters were starting to be retired and scrapped. But 4963 lucked out, because instead of scrapping her, she was put into storage in 1957, and then in 1959 was leased, along with her other surviving sister, 4943, to the Bevier and Southern Railroad, or BNS. That was a very, very small short line, only having a little over 9 miles of trackage. But it lasted until 1982 when it was finally abandoned, and now the little bit that was left is actually also a part of BNSF. Either way though, they still use steam locomotives, well past the point most other railways had abandoned them, and 4963 was safe on the railway until 1964, when the lease for her and her sister were expired. Both locomotives were then moved to Galesburg, Illinois. 4943 was sadly scrapped at this point, but 4963 again lucked out and was moved to a nearby roundhouse for storage. They just really liked storing her instead of getting rid of her. But at that time, CB&Q was actually hosting a steam excursion program, so they wanted to use 4963 for spare parts for another one of her sisters that they still had, 4960. As for the other locomotive in our story, well, that's 5632. 5632 is a much newer locomotive than 4963. She was an 05B, a 484 Northern type, built in CB&Q's shops in August of 1940. A larger locomotive with a larger wheel arrangement, she was meant for mainline passenger service, although she could pull freight trains as well. Originally, she was actually built as an 05A, but she was one of 6 05As to be converted to Bs. The only difference between the A's and the B's is the B's are oil burners. The A's were coal. She was actually almost scrapped much earlier and was put on the line to be sent to the scrapyard in 1954, but she was still around in 1958, and the CB&Q brought her out of retirement to pull a series of excursion fan trips. She did that along with a bunch of other locomotives quite successfully for a few years, But by 1961, only 2 of the locomotives were still operational and could handle doing the excursion services. One of them was 5632, and the other was 4960, the one that was getting spare parts from 4963. That's where the 2 locomotives crossed paths, and these excursion runs would continue until 1964, with 5632 pulling her last one on November 1st. That's when her flue time actually expired, and the crews needed to perform a Class 3 overhaul on her. But the problem was, a minimum of 14 workers were required for the overhaul to be completed, but CB&Q didn't have enough qualified personnel to actually do it. Most of the veteran steam mechanics had retired or passed away. It's actually a similar struggle a lot of heritage railways have even now. These are old locomotives with older technology that a lot of people going to modern engineering school, even if they know a thing or two about locomotives, wouldn't necessarily know how to fix a steam locomotive if they've been trained to work on diesels or electrics. The steam program was turning a small profit, but starting to get to the point where there wasn't enough to justify it necessarily, especially given the headache hiring people for it was. A man by the name of Harry Murphy had been the president of CB&Q, and he was very much behind keeping the steam program alive. One of his last orders prior to his retirement was that 5632's overhaul continue. He passed away less than 2 years after that, following a heart attack. His successor was named Louis Menck. Menck had no interest in continuing the steam program. He saw no inherent benefit to doing so, and he felt like it was just a waste of money. So he ordered the whole thing to be shut down by August 1st, 1966, and for 5632's overhaul to come to a screeching halt. He also ordered the scrapping of several other locomotives that were still on their roster. That would have included both 4963 and 5632, if not for the fact that a certain man that we all know stepped in. Richard Jensen. Richard Jensen was a Chicago area railfan, and like I said when I talked about 5629, he had a serious interest in running his own excursion service using his own funds and making a small profit from it to continue keeping these steam locomotives alive. He negotiated with Menck directly, as well as other management on the lines, to arrange to purchase both 5632 and 4963. Neither one of the locomotives was in operational condition at this point. 5632 had been in the middle of an overhaul, and 4963 had spent most of the last few years having parts stripped away from her. But his ultimate plan was to refurbish both locomotives and bring them back up to steam to run his excursion services, and he planned to fund this outing using 5629. He was already using 5629 at that point, and he felt that he could generate enough money from the ticket sales for 5629's runs to fix the other two. Now, in the spirit of things, I can applaud that intention, but there was no way this was going to work. Fixing a steam locomotive, especially one that is partially disassembled, is an insane undertaking that requires an insane amount of money. Not necessarily because they're steam locomotives, but because they're steam locomotives after the steam age had already died. Along with the infrastructure, the materials, the assembly lines for parts simply don't exist. Many parts that heritage railways have to use have to be custom made from scratch, and that is violently expensive to do. And the thing about heritage railways is they're in a much better position to generate revenue. Jensen never owned his own line as far as my sources are able to tell. He always rented space and always arranged to run these excursion tours on other people's lines. Now, heritage railways have overhead to cover, but they're in a much better position to generate revenue because their revenue doesn't just come from ticket sales. I mean, it does, but then they have merchandise, and when they have their own space that they own, you can offer a whole day's worth of experience at a known location, and it's much easier to talk people into just outright donating to you when you have that kind of space, rather than just locomotives that shuffle about and go wherever. I'm not saying that what Jensen was trying to do can't be done, and I can believe that 5629 could pay for herself, but not necessarily to fix 2 others on top of it. But Jensen was himself, and he went through with it, as doubtless some of you already know. Both 5632 and 4963 were moved to the Chicago and Western Indiana Railroad, CNWI, to their 47th Street roundhouse that's outside of Dearborn Station in Chicago. Jensen had actually leased some of those stalls from the CNWI to store his equipment. The sale of 5632 in particular actually came along with several boxcars full of spare parts. He'd hoped most of the parts he needed to fix these locomotives would be in the boxcars. He was good friends with the president of CWI, Robert McMillan, and McMillan really loves steam locomotives, so he was more than happy to work with Jensen when it came to storing and helping him fix and get these locomotives up and running again. And on paper, again, in the spirit of things, I applaud the effort here from a preservation perspective. Jensen did put a lot of time and work and sweat and tears into what he was trying to do, there's no question about that, but bad things happen, even with the best of intentions. He never was able to get either 5632 or 4963 up and running again, because, frankly, well, this is the part where I just don't feel like it's Jensen's fault necessarily, because he was totally kind of worked over here. So remember how I said McMillan and Jensen were friends, right? And McMillan was the president of CWI. Well, he retired suddenly in 1968, and the new owners weren't as keen on allowing Jensen to do what he was doing on their new rail line. They owned it now, and they wanted to run things a certain way, and they didn't want any of those old-timey steam locomotives around. Pshh, we don't need those. The one big thing they wanted to do was actually demolish the 47th Street roundhouse. In their defense, it was deteriorating and it would have been expensive to fix, so I can kind of see their point there. So very early, just the following year, February 27th, 1969, the new owners sent Jensen a notice that he had until March 29th to vacate the roundhouse. A month to move 2 steam locomotives. Now, recognize that, first of all, neither one was in running condition. Second of all, this is a very substantial undertaking. This isn't a normal piece of property you can just up and move. It's not even like a car. If someone leaves a car on your property, you can ask them to move it, and even if the car isn't running, tow trucks exist. But a steam locomotive is not the same thing. You need to find lines to move it across, or rent a very heavy-duty truck to move it, and you need a crane to move it on top of said truck. You need to arrange for and pay the crews to run all the equipment involved. This is really not an easy thing to do in the span of a month. Plus he had to figure out where he was even going to put these things. 5629 was not a part of this problem. She did spend some time in the rail yard, but when this notice was given, she was actually in Detroit, so she was safe from this particular problem. Jensen negotiated with the owners to try to push the deadline back to June 1st, which is a little more reasonable, but this was still a tall order. And mind you, Jensen had no knowledge that this was going to happen prior to receiving the notice. They didn't talk to him, they didn't discuss it with him, they didn't even explain their intention, they just said move him, without any kind of forward warning beyond the notice, which you could argue the notice is a warning, and I get that, but it still came out of left field as far as he was concerned. Jensen scrambled to find somewhere to even put 5632 and 4963, and the deadline passed, and by August of 1969, the locomotives were still there. And the CWI, at that point, had enough and just moved 5632 and 4963, along with the boxcars, to nearby 88th Street Yard. Jensen started to get a little bit suspicious as to what they were up to, and he asked both Chicago and Northwestern and Chicago West Pullman and Southern if an inspection was being performed in his locomotives and rolling stock, and they answered him. CWI had never allowed an inspection to take place. And September 25th is where things got downright criminal. I want to take it back to the car example for a second. Let's say, once again, someone leaves a car on your property and you want it moved. Let's say you give them a month, or 3 months. 3 months to move the car. They don't move the car. Now, ask yourself the question. Can you then sell that car and profit from its sale? No. No, you absolutely cannot. You can have it towed, and they take it to an impound lot, and it's the owner's problem to deal with them, but you, yourself, cannot sell a car that you do not own. And the same applies to locomotives. The CNWI cannot sell a locomotive that they don't actually own. Remember, that was Metra's whole thing when it came to 5629. They wanted to sell her to a museum or something, anything but what was happening. But Jensen wouldn't allow it, and the courts ordered them to scrap it. They didn't have much of an option at that point. The CNWI were actually a lot less reasonable than Metra, because not only did they illegally sell both 5632 and 4963, they did not even attempt to sell them to, say, a museum. Oh no, they sold them to the Erman-Howell division of the Luria Brothers Scrap Company. Them, along with the boxcars, sold for $5,800, and they were all moved to the 83rd Street scrapyard for storage, waiting to be cut to pieces. When Jensen found out, he was furious. And frankly, he had a right to be. This was not the legal thing to do. At this point, I could understand CNWI going to court, demanding some kind of order be given to Jensen regarding the moving the locomotives, some kind of legal process, just like Metra had done. But they sold something they didn't own, and pocketed the money, which is an outrageously illegal thing to do. Jensen, however, did not blame the scrappers at first. Now, at this point, was already planning to sue the heck out of C&WI for illegally selling his property. In the meantime, he made an effort to save both 5632 and 4963. He made an offer to repurchase the locomotives for their scrap value, which seems like a really fair thing for him to do. The scrappers probably didn't know that the railway didn't own these locomotives, and they were out money too. Jensen was offering to reimburse the scrapyard for their financial loss, and then take up his legal complaints with C&WI. Sounds great. Anyway, so Erman-Howell said no. What is the matter with everybody in a story involving Jensen? I feel like everyone he surrounds himself with, including himself, is so beyond unreasonable at one point or another. And here we are again. I don't know why Erman-Howell said no, because they were involved in an illegal sale. You'd think they wouldn't want that kind of thing on their record. They wouldn't want the association. They wouldn't want the legal hassle of dealing with that. But they still said no. So, okay. Then, in November of 1972, the world lost 5632. Both locomotives were still intact by this point, but 5632 was being relocated within the scrapyard. But she derailed. The crews had no easy way to re-rail her, so they just torched her right where she stood. However, there was still hope for 4963. She was still around. She had not been scrapped yet, and Jensen was understandably absolutely livid. He sued the heck out of both the scrap company and C&WI. During the process, Jensen was offered several settlements. The C&WI offered him $6,000 of lost scrap value, but he said no. A subsequent offer was given of $150,000. He again said no. Now, I understand Jensen, naturally at this point, has a bit of a reputation for saying no to very lucrative offers, but this was all going on before he broke his back. I think he might have been genuinely interested in saving 4963 at this point, and it wasn't really about the money necessarily. I mean, he wanted the money, but he also wanted his locomotive back, because this is ridiculous. It was an illegal sale. You couldn't have sold it. You weren't allowed to sell it, and you aren't allowed to scrap it. Also, because of the lawsuit, a hold was placed on 4963. Remember how literally weren't allowed to scrap her? So she just sat this whole time all this was going on. And this whole thing dragged on for 11 years. Seriously. It wasn't until 1981, that's 11 years after the illegal sale, 9 years after the scrapping, that the court finally ruled in Jensen's favor, actually. He won. They ordered both C&WI and Erman-Howell to pay him $1.7 million. What? How did they get to that amount? That's leaps and bounds above what they got for the illegal scrapping. I get that there's punitive damages, and perhaps they valued the locomotives higher to their historical value, and the fact that there was an illegal sale, so maybe there were some damages incurred there, but $1.7 million? Some people think that this result is what motivated Jensen to later screw around when it came to saving 5629, waiting patiently for Metro to be forced to scrap her so he could sue and get a whole bunch of money. Interestingly though, Jensen actually never received the full amount he was awarded in this lawsuit for various reasons, appeals and such. And though I led with the notion that he might have been wanting to save 4963, yeah, he didn't actually do that. See, he never arranged to move her, even though legally she was still his. And Erman-Howell, once the lawsuit was settled, started charging him rentals fees for the fact that he was using the space. He never paid them. When Jensen died in March of 1991, his sister, Rita Wide, was put in charge of selling off his remaining equipment, as well as resolving all his debts, of which there were many. Since she was not nearly as big a railfan or one at all as Jensen had been, she had no motivation to actually save 4963, and just said they could scrap the locomotive as compensation for the rental fees that were technically owed to them. She was scheduled for scrapping in fall of 1991. You might think that this is her end, but fortunately I have actually a happy ending to this story. See, there was an intervention. Originally, a proposition was actually made to the city of Chicago to acquire the locomotive and restore her so she could pull their own excursion trains around the area, but that was declined. Then the Illinois Railway Museum finally stepped in. The IRM reached an agreement with Erman-Howell, not for finances though, for a trade. They possessed 5 080 switcher steam locomotives that were originally Northwestern steel and wire. They didn't need that many of those. There was no reason for them to have that many of those. And Erman-Howell demanded a scrapping sacrifice in exchange for the life of 4963. The IRM traded those 5 locomotives in exchange for 4963. 4963 was moved to the museum's property in Union, Illinois, where she was cosmetically repainted and put on static display with the rest of the collection. As of 2023, she's still there, inside one of the museum's barns, while awaiting further cosmetic work to be performed on her. She's unlikely to ever run again, as Jensen had envisioned, but unlike her other 2 adoptive sisters, she's safe. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders: Thomas Ward, Sumdu267, Orange Glass, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Benjamin Owens, Pinzer Consume 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, DM Trouble Typhoon, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Alaric Jaspers, Brian, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Major Klutz, Hayden DeGrow, Ohio Trucker 1, and Master of None. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.